Hello again, my name is Steve Hillis and we're here to talk about Robert Merton's typology of prejudice and discrimination. In the past, many social scientists argued that prejudice was the root cause of racial and ethnic discrimination, and by extension, the underlying source of intergroup conflict and inequalities. In other words, prejudice was the thing that was kind of driving, causing discrimination, and causing these other problems. So presumably, if you could somehow reduce or eliminate prejudice, a lot of these other problems would either be greatly reduced or maybe disappear altogether. By contrast, Merton argued that the relationship between prejudice and discrimination was far more subtle and complex. In other words, Merton was certainly not convinced that prejudice was the root cause of discrimination. He wasn't saying that these things are unrelated. He believed there were relations between the two, but it wasn't a simple cause and effect relation like so many people were arguing at that time. Here we have a Mertonian typology of prejudice and discrimination. Now, typologies were very, very common among functionalists. They're basically categorization schemes, conceptual schemes that are meant to kind of simplify the social world and force us to make certain conceptual distinctions, inviting us to kind of break the world into parts and make certain kinds of comparisons. In this case, he's forcing us to look at the relationship between discrimination and prejudice. Are you prejudiced? Question mark. Do you discriminate? Well, typologies typically involve simplifying assumptions, and they're very obvious here. Do you discriminate? Yes or no? Well, that's very simplified, very black and white, very dumbed down. Obviously, in the real world, people engage in a wide range of possibly discriminatory behaviors, ranging from people that are members of hate groups to people that are very unprejudiced and everyone in between. Likewise, with prejudice. Are you prejudiced? Yes. Are you prejudiced? No. A gross oversimplification because, again, very few people have no prejudice whatsoever, and very few people are just constant, all-purpose, all-situation bigots. Nevertheless, let's keep things simple. Either you're prejudiced or you're not. Either you discriminate or you don't. And you can think about these as kind of general tendencies if you like. People who tend to discriminate. People who tend to be prejudiced against certain groups. Now, according to Merton, if you look at the relationship between discrimination and prejudice and you make that simplifying assumption, it really allows you to see something about the relationship between discrimination and prejudice that might not otherwise be obvious. Yes, some people fit the idea of an all-purpose bigot. We might call it bigots or bigotry. Are they prejudiced? Yes. Do they discriminate against a group? Yes, they're bigots. Now, those people's behavior and their attitudes, their prejudice and their discrimination are consistent. And at least those people are consistent with our idea that maybe prejudice might be the root cause or one of the root causes of discrimination. But turns out that a lot of other people don't fit in this cell. What about those people who are not prejudiced but they do discriminate? Here we have a case that's a little, well, counterintuitive, but frankly, if you think about it a little bit, this idea of institutional discrimination that Merton helped develop is really a very powerful insight, and one, frankly, if you think about it for more than a second, makes a lot of sense. How can you be prejudiced? No, you're not prejudiced, and yet you discriminate. Well, sometimes it's built into the system. It's part of job rules, it's part of rules, laws, policies, and so forth. Years ago, when I was working at a particular finance company, I won't say which one it was, but when I came out from my undergrad degree, I worked a fairly bad job. It was not one I enjoyed. And frankly, they were engaged in an activity that I believed to be illegal under federal lending law. They appeared to be using what might be called racial coding. They were recording using subtle little codes, the race and ethnicity of people, and then passing that up the chain of command to people who were either approving or rejecting loan applications. Now, in the best of my experience working in there for the time that I did when I was much younger, I could not tell whether they were actually actively discriminating against any racial or ethnic minority, with one clear exception in my own experience, and that was Asian Indians. For some reason, one of our higher level supervisors, kind of upper middle management type, had this real thing against Asian Indians, and I have no idea why. Now, the thing that was interesting to me is, if you watch this guy's behavior carefully, if it was a big loan, he did not care what race or ethnicity you were. You could be Asian Indian, or for that matter, any other race or persuasion. It didn't matter, because those big loans really made him look good. The finance companies at that time really were run on numbers, and if you had big loan numbers, you looked better if you were a higher level manager. Now, at times, though, you were making piddly loans, little loans that weren't very profitable, and frankly, it didn't really matter in the big picture whether you lent out a few bucks to someone or you didn't. At least if you were way up the feeding chain, there wasn't much of an incentive one way or the other. You didn't have much to lose if you discriminated. So there it appeared like maybe sometimes he was discriminating against Asian Indians. I couldn't have proved it at the time, even if I had tried, but that was the impression I had. Now, let's say that impression was right. We still did his bidding. When I say we, I mean everyone who worked there. We had many employees who worked there, some of them black, Hispanic, white, Asian, and of course myself. And all of us were, well, good little Nazis. I hate saying it, but we all followed rules. We all filled in the loan applications, and we all did the little racial coding that none of us should have been doing. Why did we do it? Was it because of any personal prejudices against specific groups, especially against Asian Indians? I personally seriously doubt it. The vast majority of people who worked in this area, I was working in Indianapolis at the time and a few other areas in central Indiana, frankly, the Asian Indian population at that time was fairly low. And frankly, a lot of the people that were working there at these finance companies had very little or no experience with Asian Indians at all. They simply didn't know them. And frankly, I doubt they had much opinion one way or the other about Asian Indians. I hate saying it this way because it sounds so cold, but it was quite literally nothing personal. They were just following rules, and I was just following rules. That's a classic example of institutional discrimination, where discrimination is built in to the operation of an organization, its rules, its procedures, its decision-making. This type of discrimination is not individualized, it's not personal, and it's not closely related to personal prejudice or individual prejudice. Literally, people in these cases are responding more to the rewards and punishments, to social pressure, obeying authority figures, and so forth. It's more about the situation they're in, the role they're playing, as opposed to their own personal beliefs or inclinations. The result is people can, and sometimes do, systematically discriminate against one group or another, even though they personally don't hold any kind of individual prejudice against them. Here's another example, latent bigotry. In this case, a person is prejudiced, yes, but do they discriminate? No. That's the reason it's called latent bigotry. It's kind of hidden bigotry. Bigotry that does not express itself in behavior. Well, let's say you go to a restaurant, you have a waiter or waitress there, and they treat you nice, they laugh at your jokes, they seem to care how you like your meal, they're friendly, they're attentive, in various ways, they seem to like you. Do they like you? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe they don't care if you roll over and die as long as they get their tip and they stay out of trouble. Maybe. How could you tell the difference? Well, maybe if you're very good at reading people, you can pick up subtle clues or cues, but you know what? A lot of times it might not even be possible to tell the difference between a waiter or waitress that's just really good at getting what they want, presenting themselves in a certain way to get what they want. What do they get out of it? Well, again, they get a tip. They don't get yelled at by their manager. They don't get fired. They don't get in constant hassles and confrontation with their customers. Well, how would you know if they didn't, not just like you, but maybe they don't like anyone like you? Maybe they are prejudiced against your entire group. Maybe. Could you tell that? Once again, maybe you could and maybe not, because they have strong incentives, strong motivations too, to hide their prejudices and not to act on them. The prejudiced waiter or waitress still wants a tip, Even a bigoted waiter or waitress doesn't want to get fired in a lot of cases, so they have every incentive to put on self-presentations and do their jobs in such a way where no one can tell the difference. In other words, in that case, prejudice does not map into behavior, but for a different reason. In this case, there's strong situational pressures, social pressures, incentives, rules, and all of that. This kind of pushing bigoted people away from discriminating. Actually, that's something that both of these share in common. In both the case of latent bigotry and institutional discrimination, people are not really acting according to their own personal barometers or their own personal values or preferences, their own personal racial attitudes. Instead, they're largely being pushed and pulled around by situational factors, organizational factors, social pressures, fear of getting fired, demoted, and so forth. So the situation is driving their behavior more than their own personal attitudes. Finally, you have the last cell here, which again, just like bigotry, does have a certain kind of behavioral consistency. Remember, with bigotry, people were prejudiced and they discriminated. They walked the walk, they talked the talk. Their behavior was consistent with their underlying attitudes. That is most definitely not the case here or here. What about here? Well, once again, we have an example here where behavior and attitudes are consistent. In this case, people are not prejudiced and they don't discriminate. They're non-bigots. Now, if you take a step away from this and kind of try to get the broad sense of what Merton was trying to argue, it's pretty straightforward. The relationship between prejudice and discrimination actually is pretty complicated and subtle, and any argument that prejudiced people discriminate, and anytime you see discrimination it's because someone was prejudiced, at least on an individual basis, that is a real leap. If Merton is right, then these old arguments about prejudice, individual prejudice, personal prejudice being the root cause of discrimination, is at least only partially correct some of the time. Here. On the other hand, many other types of discrimination are not related, or the absence of discrimination, are not related to personal prejudice. So for example, you could have people who were discriminating, who weren't prejudiced, and you could have people that were not discriminating, who were prejudiced. In both cases, there's a very weak, loose relationship between a person's attitudes towards another group of people and how they actually react to them or treat them. In these cells, there's almost no relationship between attitudes and behavior, and in these cells, there is a relationship. Merton's really making a point that whatever the relationship between prejudice and discrimination, it's not as simple as prejudice causes discrimination. Something a lot more complicated, subtle, and complex is going on here. Well, I think that pretty much finishes up our discussion. The only other thing I want to point out is that Robert Merton's analysis, whatever you think about it, was ahead of its time, because a lot of later researchers have kind of changed the way that psychologists, sociologists, and others view the relationship between prejudice and discrimination. A lot of later researchers are kind of following, at least loosely, broadly, in kind of the tradition of Merton, because they're arguing that the relationship between prejudice and discrimination is not a simple causal one, and in fact, maybe prejudice and discrimination are both caused by other things. At any rate, they share with Robert Merton a skepticism about simple arguments that prejudice is the root cause of discrimination. Thank you very much.